The first hour of a war does not begin with clarity. It begins with confusion that spreads faster than any explosion. Lights remain on in some places while others go dark without warning. Phones vibrate with fragments of information, alerts, rumors, half-confirmed reports, none of which provide a complete picture. Traffic patterns shift abruptly as people move without coordination, driven by instinct rather than strategy. This is the most dangerous phase, not because of the scale of destruction, but because systems designed for stability are suddenly forced into instability without transition time. The danger is not just the external threat, but the internal breakdown of how people process information under stress. From a systems perspective, modern cities operate on tightly coupled networks. Power grids, telecommunications, transportation, and emergency services are interdependent. When one node is disrupted, whether by physical damage, cyber interference, or overload, the effects cascade. This is known in engineering as a cascading failure, where the failure of a single component triggers a chain reaction through connected systems. In the first hour of conflict, these cascades are often invisible at first. A delay in communication here, a localized outage there, and suddenly coordination begins to fracture. Emergency services may still function, but response times increase. Information becomes outdated the moment it is received. The system is still running, but no longer synchronized. Most people misunderstand this phase. They expect war to be immediately visible, loud, and geographically obvious. In reality, the initial stage is often ambiguous. There may be no clear front line, no clear instructions, and no immediate confirmation of what is happening. This ambiguity creates a cognitive bottleneck. The human brain, under uncertainty, defaults to normalcy bias, the assumption that things are not as bad as they seem. People continue routines, delay decisions, and wait for confirmation. This delay is critical. In emergency management, time is not measured in hours but in decision windows. The first hour contains the highest value decisions, yet it is the period when individuals are least likely to act effectively. The hidden science behind this lies in how humans process risk under incomplete information. Studies in disaster psychology show that individuals require multiple consistent signals before they change behavior. A single alert is often dismissed. Even 2 or 3 conflicting reports can reduce perceived urgency rather than increase it. This is compounded by information latency. By the time a warning reaches the public, it may already be outdated due to the speed of unfolding events. In technical terms, the system suffers from signal lag, where the input does not reflect the current state of the system. This mismatch leads to decisions based on conditions that no longer exist. Evidence from real-world incidents reinforces this pattern. During large-scale blackouts, evacuation delays, and sudden infrastructure failures, post-event analyses consistently show that the majority of people did not respond immediately, even when early warning signs were present. Communication logs reveal gaps between official alerts and public action. Traffic data shows congestion spikes not at the moment of initial disruption, but after secondary confirmation spreads through informal channels. This delay is not due to ignorance, but to the inherent limitations of human perception under stress. People wait for certainty in situations where certainty never arrives. The survival implications are direct and uncompromising. The first hour is not about gathering perfect information. It is about recognizing instability early and reducing exposure to system failures. This means understanding that services you rely on, electricity, mobile networks, fuel distribution, may degrade rapidly even if they appear functional. It means anticipating that access points such as roads and communication channels may become congested or unreliable without warning. Survival in this phase is less about reaction and more about preemptive positioning. Where you are, what you have access to, and how quickly you can adapt will determine outcomes before the situation fully reveals itself. As the situation escalates, the gap between perception and reality widens. Secondary effects begin to emerge. Fuel supply chains experience pressure not because of immediate shortages, but because of demand spikes and distribution disruptions. Hospitals shift from routine operations to emergency protocols, reducing capacity for non-critical cases. Communication networks experience saturation, where the volume of usage exceeds system capacity, leading to dropped calls and delayed messages. These are not failures in isolation. They are indicators that the system is entering a stressed state. Each signal, taken alone, may seem manageable. Together, they form a pattern of accelerating instability. The transition into the next phase is marked not by a single event, but by the accumulation of small disruptions reaching a tipping point. At this stage, the environment becomes less predictable. Actions that were safe minutes ago may no longer be safe. Routes that were open become blocked. Information that was accurate becomes obsolete. The system has not collapsed, but it is no longer reliable. This is where the second layer of risk begins to surface, one that is less visible but far more consequential. The second hour does not announce itself with a clear boundary, yet its risks are fundamentally different. What was previously confusion now begins to harden into fragmentation. Communication, once delayed, becomes selectively unavailable. Certain channels function while others fail entirely, creating pockets of isolation within the same city. The danger here is no longer just uncertainty, but asymmetry. Some individuals receive critical updates while others operate in informational silence. This uneven distribution of knowledge creates unpredictable human behavior, as decisions are no longer based on shared understanding but on incomplete and often contradictory inputs. From an analytical standpoint, this phase reflects a transition from system stress to partial system degradation. Infrastructure does not fail uniformly. Power grids may reroute electricity, keeping some regions active while shedding load in others. Telecommunications networks prioritize certain data types, often reducing the quality or availability of civilian communication. Transportation systems begin to exhibit nonlinear behavior, where small disruptions produce disproportionately large effects. This is a hallmark of complex adaptive systems under strain. The system attempts to stabilize itself, but in doing so, it introduces variability that is difficult to predict at the individual level. A common misunderstanding during this phase is the assumption that visible stability equals actual stability. If lights are on, if water flows, if roads appear open, people interpret these signals as confirmation that the situation is under control. However, engineering models show that systems often maintain surface functionality even as internal reserves are being depleted. Backup power systems, for example, can sustain operations temporarily, but they rely on finite fuel supplies and require logistical support that may already be compromised. The illusion of continuity delays critical decisions, locking individuals into positions that may soon become untenable. The hidden science driving this illusion lies in buffering capacity. Modern infrastructure is designed with layers of redundancy to absorb shocks. These buffers create a time lag between disruption and visible failure. While this design increases resilience under normal conditions, it can also obscure the severity of a rapidly evolving crisis. By the time the buffer is exhausted, the transition from functional to non-functional can be abrupt rather than gradual. This creates a false sense of security during the most critical decision window, when proactive movement or resource management would be most effective. Evidence from emergency management case studies highlights this pattern repeatedly. In large-scale urban disruptions, critical services often continue operating for a limited period despite upstream failures. Water systems maintain pressure even after pumping stations lose power, due to gravity-fed reserves. Hospitals continue procedures using backup generators until fuel constraints force prioritization. Communication networks remain partially active until congestion thresholds are exceeded. In each case, the visible system lags behind the actual state of underlying support structures. When failure becomes visible, it is often too late for low-risk adaptation. The survival implications in this phase shift from awareness to timing. Recognizing that visible stability may be temporary is essential. Decisions must account for not only current conditions but also the trajectory of those conditions. Remaining in place may appear safe, but if that location depends on fragile supply chains or strained infrastructure, its risk profile can change rapidly. Mobility, however, is not a guaranteed solution. Movement introduces exposure to congested routes, uncertain conditions, and competition for limited resources. The critical factor is not whether to move or stay, but when and under what assumptions. As conditions escalate further, resource competition begins to surface in subtle ways. Retail environments experience sudden demand surges, not necessarily from panic, but from delayed collective realization. Supply chains, optimized for efficiency rather than redundancy, struggle to respond to these spikes. Fuel stations see increased usage, not because supply has ceased, but because distribution cannot match demand velocity. This creates localized shortages that propagate outward, amplifying stress across the system. The feedback loop is self-reinforcing. Perceived scarcity drives behavior that creates actual scarcity. The transition from individual decision-making to collective behavior marks a critical escalation point. Human systems, like technical systems, exhibit tipping points. Once a certain threshold of behavior is reached, whether it is increased traffic flow, elevated network usage, or concentrated demand for resources, the system shifts into a new state. This state is less stable and more sensitive to additional stressors. Small disruptions that would have been absorbed earlier now trigger disproportionate consequences. A minor road blockage can cascade into widespread gridlock. A temporary network slowdown can result in communication blackouts. At this stage, the environment becomes defined by reduced reliability and increased volatility. Predictive models lose accuracy because the variables are no longer stable. Information becomes both more critical and less trustworthy. Individuals must rely on principles rather than data, understanding how systems behave under stress rather than reacting to isolated signals. This requires a shift from reactive thinking to anticipatory thinking, where decisions are made based on likely system trajectories rather than current appearances. The final escalation within this window is not a single collapse, but the alignment of multiple degraded systems. Power instability, communication gaps, transportation congestion, and resource pressure begin to interact in ways that amplify overall risk. Each system failure increases the load on others, accelerating the cycle. What began as a series of manageable disruptions converges into a complex, interconnected crisis. At this point, the margin for error narrows significantly, and the consequences of delayed or misinformed decisions become far more severe.